In the photograph, she is Mrs. Fred Trump of Jamaica Estates. A fur stole across her shoulders, the set hair. The composed half-smile of a woman who has spent decades on hospital committees and posing for the local society pages. Behind her, in the ballroom, is a 228-bed nursing home pavilion that will one day carry her name. But look at the paperwork of her arrival. 1930. A Glasgow visa, an 18-year-old girl from a Gaelic-speaking croft on the Isle of Lewis, about $50 in her pocket, and one word written down in a clerk's hand to describe what she did for a living. Domestic. This is the story of the 63 years that lay between those two documents, and it is grimmer than America ever knew. If you want the truth behind the women the cameras adored and the world discarded, subscribe to Disposable Glamour so you never miss the next story. This one is about a woman who spent 60 years perfecting her silence. Chapter 1. The ballroom, the pavilion, the fur stole. Look at her, first. The way the local society pages of Queens and Long Island wanted you to look at her. There is a version of Mary Anne MacLeod Trump that lived in the newspapers of the outer boroughs for close to 5 decades, and it is worth starting there, because it is the version most people who met her ever saw. She sits at a committee table in a hotel ballroom on Long Island. The tablecloth is white. There is a small vase of flowers. There is a coffee cup at her elbow. She is in her 50s, or her 60s, or her 70s, depending on the year. And the year keeps changing, but the surface does not. The hair is set. The lipstick is pale. The suit is tailored. The fur, stole when the season calls for it, is draped over the back of her chair. Her hands are folded. Her chin is level. Her smile is small, composed, and it stops before it reaches her eyes. She is Mrs. Fred Trump of Jamaica Estates. That is how the caption reads. That is how the woman next to her introduces her at the microphone. That is how she has been listed on the letterhead of the Women's Auxiliary of Jamaica Hospital for a very long time. The auxiliary raises money for the hospital, and she has raised it. She has been on the committee for cerebral palsy services. She has given her name to disability services. She has given her time to the Salvation Army, to the Boy Scouts, to services for the blind. In the local press she is described, again and again, as a philanthropist. It is a heavy word for a woman who never held a paying job past the age of 23. It is a heavy word, and it is her word, and she wears it exactly as she wears the fur stole. The pavilion is coming. That is the thing to hold in your mind, watching her at that ballroom table. Somewhere in her middle life, in the plans of the Jamaica Hospital Medical Center, a nursing home pavilion is being drawn on paper. 228 beds, old people mostly, in the last chapters of their own lives. When it is finished and dedicated, and a plaque is fixed to the wall, the plaque will read her name, Mary Anne MacLeod Trump, in gold letters. On a wall inside a hospital in the borough where she has lived, married and widowed, since the winter of 1936. She is proud of this. That is a fair thing to say. There are photographs of her at the ceremony, at similar ceremonies, at similar hospital tables, over a span of years long enough that the fashions change 3 times behind her, and she does not. The composure is not a mask she puts on for the flashbulb. The composure is her. In every image, she is exactly the same woman. In every image, she is Mrs. Fred Trump of Jamaica Estates. Now hold that image, the ballroom, the fur stole, the pavilion door with her name on it. Hold it very carefully, because it is going to be, for the next hour and a half, the most important object in this film. Because the woman inside the fur stole was not born as Mrs. Fred Trump of Jamaica Estates. She was born on the 10th of May, 1912, on a small island in the North Atlantic that had once been called, in her own first language, Leodas, in English, Lewis. In the crofting township of Tong, 3 miles by road from the harbour at Stornoway, in a house that spoke Scottish Gaelic before it spoke anything else, to a mother named Mary and a father named Malcolm, as the last of 10 children, in a family that fished and worked a small piece of land and lived, most winters, extremely close to the bone. That woman, the woman under the fir stole, spoke Gaelic for the rest of her life. She spoke it on her visits back to the island. She spoke it quietly, in her own head. She did not speak much of anything else, in public, about who she had been before she stepped off a ship in New York in the spring of 1930 at the age of 18, with about $50 in her pocket and the word domestic written next to her name. We are about to spend a great deal of time inside the gap between those two women. We are about to spend a great deal of time inside a marriage of 63 years that held the gap in place. And we are going to see, in the documented, sourced, careful details of the record, that what lay between the ballroom and the arrival hall was grimmer than the country she reinvented herself inside ever knew. Before Jamaica Estates, there was Tong. Chapter 2. The wounded island she came from. Before the pavilion had a name, before the furs, before New York, there was Tong, a crofting township 3 miles from Stornoway on the Isle of Lewis. You have to picture it in weather, because the weather is a character on Lewis. The Atlantic pushes at the island from the west. The wind comes off the sea and does not stop for days. The light, in the winter, is thin and low and grey by 3 in the afternoon. The soil is thin. The rock lies close under the grass. The houses in the crofting townships stand in a row along the road, low, whitewashed, with peat stacks against the gable end for winter fuel. Tong is one of these townships, 3 miles from the harbour of Stornoway, half fields, half sea, half work, half cold. Malcolm MacLeod, her father, was a crofter and a fisherman. He held a small piece of ground, worked it, kept a few sheep, went out in a small boat when the weather allowed. He also, for pay, served as the compulsory attendance officer at the local school, the man whose job it was to walk to the door of a house where a child was not turning up and ask, in the language of that house, why. That house, in his own case, spoke Scottish Gaelic. So did most of the doors he called on. English was a language you learned at school, from a book, from a teacher, later. Gaelic was the language you learned before you knew you were learning a language at all. Mary MacLeod, her mother, whose maiden name had been Smith, had already borne 9 children before her 10th arrived on the 10th of May, 1912. The 10th was named Mary, after her, and Anne, and she would go by both, the youngest of 10, the last of a very long line of small hands at a small table, in a small house, on a small island, at the far edge of Europe. 1912. The world she was born into was still, at that moment, a world of empires and coal smoke and steamer trunks and telegrams. It was 2 years short of a war that would take, from her island alone, an extraordinary proportion of its men. Then the war came. Lewis and the neighbouring island of Harris sent their young men to the fronts of the First World War in numbers that hollowed the villages. The Royal Naval Reserve, the Merchant Marine, the Highland regiments, the trawlers commandeered as minesweepers. Her older brothers were, by the time she was old enough to notice, either at sea or being watched by their mothers for the way they walked when they came home. When the war ended in November of 1918, the island began, cautiously, to breathe. And then, on the 1st of January, 1919, the Iolaire went down. She was 6 years old. The Iolaire was a naval yacht carrying Lewis and Harris men, home from the war. Sailors, reservists, sons and fathers and brothers and husbands coming back from 4 years away to be met on the pier at Stornoway by families who had not seen them in a lifetime. On the 1st of January, 1919, in the dark, in a rising wind, the ship struck rocks near the mouth of Stornoway Harbour. She grounded within sight of the shore. About 200 men died there, most of them Lewis and Harris men, most of them within a few hundred yards of the beach they had grown up on. Some drowned, some were smashed against the rocks. A few, by luck, swam or were hauled ashore. The disaster is remembered today as one of the worst peacetime maritime disasters in United Kingdom waters, and on Lewis it is remembered as the night the island lost, in 1 hour, the men it had already spent a war getting ready to lose. Mary Anne MacLeod was 6. She would have heard, in Gaelic, in her own house, the sound of a community trying to work out how to bury more than 100 men whose bodies were washing in with the tide. She would have watched her own family reckon with who was on that ship and who was not. She would have understood, in the exact language of her own kitchen, what had happened. The Iolaire was the second wound. The war was the first. Together they took from Lewis so much of what the island had left of its next generation of young men, and set the young women who remained on the pier looking at an island that could no longer feed them. The emigration wave of the 1920s followed. It carried Lewis families to Canada. It carried Lewis women to New York. It carried her older sisters west, one by one. It carried, in the end, her. The wounded island did not push her out. It stood behind her and did not offer her a reason to stay. By the time she was 15, 16, 17, there were letters coming back from America. Sisters in service, sisters married, sisters sending money, sisters saying, "Come." And in Tong, in a house that spoke Gaelic, on the road 3 miles from Stornoway, a small, hard 18-year-old girl at the edge of her adult life sat by the peat fire and did the arithmetic of leaving. She made her choice. She would take the ferry to the mainland. She would take the train to Glasgow. She would take a ship. She would go. Chapter 3. The Crossing, and one word on the paperwork. On the 2nd of May, 1930, she sailed from Glasgow aboard the RMS Transylvania, and 9 days later a clerk in New York wrote one word to describe what she did for a living. The paperwork of the crossing is the most important paperwork in her life. The rest of the century will circle around it. So slow down here, at the beginning of 1930, and look at what the official record actually shows, because after 1930 she says very little on her own behalf, and the paperwork will end up doing most of the speaking. Early in 1930, at the American consulate in Glasgow, she was issued an immigration visa. The visa was numbered, it was recorded. It went in a file. She was 18 by the moment of sailing, and she had, on her, the visa and the ticket, and, per the later record, about $50. $50 in the spring of 1930, for a single Scottish girl travelling alone, was not nothing. It was not much either. It was the difference between arriving able to hire a room for a week and arriving unable to. It was the difference between having something and having next to nothing. We flag this now, once, and let it stand. The claim that Mary Anne MacLeod entered the United States as an illegal immigrant, a claim that circulated in her son's later political life, has been checked by fact-checkers and by immigration historians, and it is false. She held an immigration visa. It was issued in Glasgow in early 1930. She travelled on it. She landed on it. The word for what she was, in immigration law, is documented. This film is not going to spend one more sentence on that particular argument. The record says what the record says, and this film goes by the record. She sailed from Glasgow on the 2nd of May 1930 aboard a ship called the RMS Transylvania. It was a working steamer of its era. The Atlantic in early May is cold and grey. She would have known the ship for the length of the crossing, the way a prisoner knows a cell. And then, on the 11th of May 1930, one day after her 18th birthday, the ship came in and tied up at a pier in New York. She stepped off. She would have carried very little: a small trunk, a coat, a hat, the visa in her coat, about $50. And on the passenger and immigration record filed that day, in a clerk's hand, next to her name and her age and her country of origin and the vessel of arrival, the clerk wrote down what she had said she did for a living. The word he wrote was domestic, or domestic servant, depending on the precise line of the document. In the vocabulary of the American immigration bureaucracy of 1930, that meant one thing and one thing only. She was a woman who scrubbed the floors of other people's houses. She was a woman who lit their fires, made their beds, boiled their laundry, watched their children, washed their dishes, answered their doors. She was a woman whose job in the American economy was to be, physically, in the kitchens of the American middle class. She was a servant. The clerk was not lying, and she was not lying. That is what she was going to be. That is what she said she would be, or was, or had come to be. The Astoria neighbourhood of Queens, where an older sister already lived, was full of Lewis and Scottish and Irish girls who were doing exactly that work in exactly that year. She was joining a stream. She was one drop of a very large migration of Scottish and Irish women into American service, running along the coast, out from the piers, into the row houses and the brownstones and the outer borough streets, into the apartments and the mansions on Long Island in the years around the opening of the Great Depression. That is what the paperwork said: domestic. In a hand that did not know it was writing down the mother of a future president of the United States. In a hand that did not know it was writing down a woman who, 70 years later, would have a hospital pavilion named for her and would die at 88 with a Manhattan funeral and a Queen's burial. In a hand that was, on the 11th of May 1930, doing its usual afternoon's paperwork. The word is going to come back at us over the course of this film. It is going to sit at the back of every ballroom photograph. It is going to sit under every fur stole. It is going to sit in the walls of the pavilion. It is going to sit inside the 63-year marriage. Domestic. One word. In one clerk's hand. On the 11th of May, 1930. Say it now, once, and keep it in your ear. This film is going to say it again exactly twice. She left the pier. She went into New York. She took, per the standard account, a train or a subway or a streetcar or some combination of them out to Astoria in Queens to the address of her sister. The sister opened the door. The sister took her in. The 18-year-old girl from Tong, with the coat and the trunk and the $50 and the visa and the word domestic and the Gaelic she had been speaking since she was small enough to be picked up, walked in from the street and closed the door behind her. That was the last day of her life on which her origin was not something she was actively holding at a distance. The American century, as she was about to live it, had just begun. Chapter 4. Depression, New York, and the Sisters in Service. The Great Depression opened around her arrival, and the American economy that had summoned her offered one main entry to a single Scottish girl with about $50. The Great Depression had opened in the months before her ship reached the pier. By the spring of 1930, when she stepped off the Transylvania, the American economy was already in serious trouble. The country she had come to was, over the next several years, going to shed jobs faster than at any other point in its history. And yet, she got work. She got work almost at once. She got work in the one part of the American labour market that, for a young immigrant woman with a Scottish accent and physical stamina and a willingness to live where she worked, hardly noticed the depression at all. Domestic service in New York in the early 1930s was a labour system with its own gravitational field. It ran on immigrant women, as the source doc puts it, in one of the main routes by which single immigrant women, and Scottish and Irish women in particular, entered the American economy. In that period, a wave of Scottish and Irish women, many of them from the Hebrides and the west coast of Scotland, arrived and slotted straight into these jobs: live-in cook, live-in maid, live-in nurse for the households that would take them. The wages were modest: $10 a week, $12 a week, $15 a week, depending on the household and the skills and the year. Room and board on top. In a country where roughly a quarter of the workforce was going to be, at some point over the next few years, out of a job entirely, $10 a week and a bed you did not have to pay for was a job you kept your head down for. You did not complain. You did not talk back. You held it. Astoria in Queens, where her sister had already settled, was one of the many neighbourhoods of the outer boroughs to which these women commuted from, or stayed with family in, or based themselves out of. A Scottish girl, newly off her ship, arriving at her sister's door in 1930, entered a network. Someone knew a family in Bay Ridge who needed a girl. Someone knew a family in Forest Hills. Someone knew a family in the near suburbs. Someone knew a family with an infant. Someone knew a family that had just let a girl go. The network placed her, and the household took her, and she went to work. The precise sequence of her domestic service years in the first half of the 1930s is not fully reconstructible from the surviving public record, and the sources conflict on some details. So let us stay strictly with what the paperwork proves and what the family, over the years, has said. She worked in domestic service after arriving. That is stated in the record of her arrival and in later reporting. She spent, by her family's accounts, roughly 4 to 5 years in this work in New York, sometimes for a stretch, sometimes with returns home in between. The passenger records show at least 2 crossings in the early 1930s. In September of 1934, she is documented sailing back to Scotland on a steamer called the SS Cameronia, travelling with a United States re-entry permit, which is the paperwork you carry when you have already been admitted to the United States and are travelling out with the intention to come back. By the middle of the 1930s, she is again on the American side of the ocean, living, per the family's accounts, with her sister in Queens. Say what the paperwork says. At least 2 crossings, a visa, a re-entry permit. Do not, over that thin evidence, build a clean line. There is no clean line to build. There is a young Scottish woman, alone, moving back and forth across the Atlantic in the depths of the Great Depression, working in service on one side, going home to a Gaelic-speaking crofting family on the other, arriving each time at a different point on her own private map. Why she came. This is the question the sources genuinely disagree on. Some accounts, especially the standard immigration history reading, treat the first crossing as work-motivated. A Lewis girl in the Depression era, following her sisters into New York domestic service, part of a much larger economic migration off a wounded island. Other accounts, drawing on family tellings, describe an early trip that was framed as a visit, a stay with relatives, that lengthened, that turned into staying. The truth is probably both. The truth is probably that she came intending, or half intending, or hoping, and stayed because staying became possible. The record does not require us to choose. The record shows a girl who moved several times between 2 continents in the early 1930s and ended, by the middle of the decade, on this side. What is clear is what the work was. It was scrubbing, cooking, washing, watching children. It was rising in the dark to make breakfast for other people's children before her employers came down. It was standing at a sink at the back of a house that was not hers, with her hands in water, listening to a wireless she was not being paid to listen to, in a country whose language she had learned second. It was the invisible labour of the American home. She did this, on and off, for something in the order of 4 to 5 years. At the end of those years, she met a builder from the Bronx at a party in Queens. Chapter 5. The Presbyterian Church, the Carlyle, the servant, marries up. They met, by the standard account, at a party in Queens in the middle of the 1930s, and the whole distance she had crossed then closed in one afternoon. Fred Trump, in the middle of the 1930s, was already a man other men in the outer boroughs paid attention to. He had been born in the Bronx in 1905 to a family of German immigrant heritage. By the age of 30, Fred had already been building for several years. He was, by every account of him at that age, driven in a way that struck people who watched him work as not quite ordinary. He kept a hard schedule. He counted every nail. He was going somewhere. And the people who met him at a Queen's party in the middle of the 1930s did not always know exactly where, but they knew he was going. He met a Scottish girl there. The standard tellings put the introduction at a party in Queens in the middle of the 1930s. She was working in service. He was building. They courted. And on the 11th of January, 1936, they married. The ceremony was held at a Presbyterian church on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. The reception was held at the Carlyle Hotel in Manhattan, about 25 guests. A small ceremony in an old money frame. Then a honeymoon in Atlantic City, on the New Jersey shore, in the middle of a very cold January. She was 23. Consider what the wedding day actually meant, on the ground, for the woman who walked out of the Carlyle that afternoon on the arm of Fred Trump. She had been, 6 years earlier, a girl at a pier in New York with a coat and a trunk and about $50. She had spent the 6 years since scrubbing other people's floors. She had come from a crofting family on the Isle of Lewis, in which cash money had been rare enough that individual coins were remembered. She had been, on her own arrival paperwork, domestic. And here she was, on the 11th of January, 1936, on a Manhattan Avenue, in a wedding dress, walking into the Carlyle Hotel for a reception at the Carlyle Hotel, in a marriage that was going to place her, over the next 20 years, in a large house in Jamaica Estates with staff of her own. That distance, closed on an afternoon in January, that is the class hinge of her life. The rest of the film is what she did with it. Naturalization followed 6 years later. On the 10th of March 1942, in the second full year of the Second World War, she took the oath of United States citizenship. She was 30. She was, by then, the mother of 2 children already, and pregnant with, or about to conceive, a third. The Gaelic-speaking Lewis girl, on the 11th of May, 1930, had become, on the 10th of March, 1942, Mrs. Fred Trump of Queens, a citizen of the country whose kitchens she had scrubbed on arrival. The 5 children came in a rush across 11 years. Mary Anne first, born in 1937. Then Fred Jr., born in 1938. Then Elizabeth, in 1942. Then Donald, in 1946. Then Robert, in 1948. 2 daughters, 3 sons. A busy house. A steady succession of pregnancies stretched across the years of the war and the years after it. A woman in her 20s and early 30s who was, by the arithmetic of her own body, more or less continuously pregnant, nursing, or recovering, for a decade. The family settled in Jamaica Estates, in Queens, in a large house that became the family seat. It had staff. the girl who had arrived in 1930 and been placed by an immigration clerk in the category of domestic, walked, in the middle of the 1940s, into a house where domestics worked for her. You can hold that image against the earlier one. The pier, the trunk, the visa, the $50, the word domestic. She had crossed. But she had crossed inside a marriage. And what that marriage was, as an interior room, is where the surface of Mrs. Fred Trump of Jamaica Estates begins to require a careful, sourced, attributed telling. Chapter 6. Fred's Fortune and the Federally Underwritten Furs. The furs and the charity luncheons that would define her public surface were paid for, substantially, by federally underwritten rent. That sentence is important, so let us slow down and unpack it, because it is the systemic pin of this film, and it is where the story stops being a story about one woman's ascent and starts being a story about which arm of the American government paid for her fur stole. Fred Trump's building operation, in the years around the marriage and through the decade that followed, was located mostly in Queens and Brooklyn. He built houses first, and then apartment blocks, and then more apartment blocks. He was, by the accounts of the men who worked with him, extraordinarily attentive to costs, to schedules, to the small saved dollar on each nail. He drove his crews. He drove himself. And, in a decision that would define the family's finances for the rest of the century, he located his buildings squarely inside the new federal housing programs that the Roosevelt administration had, from the middle of the 1930s, put in place. The Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, in the middle of the 1930s, was the arm of the federal government that stood behind the country's residential building. Its central purpose was to make it easier for Americans to borrow money to build and to buy housing, by ensuring the mortgages so that banks would lend more freely and at longer terms. In practice, for builders like Fred Trump, that meant a specific and highly lucrative dynamic. If you built the right kind of housing, in the right kind of neighborhood, to the right kind of specification, the FHA would insure the mortgage that financed the building. You could, in effect, build with borrowed money that the federal government was standing behind. The building went up, the units rented, the mortgage was serviced out of the rents, and the profits, at the end of it, sat in your own pocket. Fred Trump was, through the late 1930s and through the war years, and through the post-war boom of the late 1940s and early 1950s, one of the most active builders in the outer boroughs to work this way. His apartment complexes rose in Queens and in Brooklyn, long stretches of brick, up out of the flatland, with the FHA logo, in effect, standing invisibly behind them. The rents came in, the workers moved in. Fred moved on to the next site. By the late 1940s, he was, by any reasonable measure, a wealthy man. By the middle 1950s, he was wealthier still. By the end of the 1960s, he was one of the outer borough's major landlords and developers. By the time he died in 1999, the estate would be valued, by contemporary reporting, in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Decades later, a New York Times investigation in 2018 would trace enormous sums moving from Fred to his children over the course of many years through various structures. Mary Anne, throughout, was in the household. Not in the business, not on the sites, not in the meetings with FHA officials, not in the correspondence with the bankers. She was in the house on the Jamaica Estates house. She was running the household. She was raising the children. She was moving into her public role as a hospital committee wife. But the money that paid for the house on the Jamaica Estates house, and for the staff inside it, and for the fur stole she draped over her chair at the ballroom, came out of the rents from those apartment complexes. And a substantial share of those rents came out of buildings that had been built on federally insured mortgages and on wartime and post-war federal housing program money and on the general expansion of government-backed lending that made outer borough apartment building in the middle of the 20th century one of the great personal fortunes available to a builder with the right work ethic and the right relationships. This is the system this film names, not obliquely, directly. Federal money underwrote the fortune. The fortune paid for the surface. The surface was Mary Anne MacLeod Trump of Jamaica Estates. Every philanthropic luncheon, every hospital plaque, every set of furs, every set hair appointment, every winter coat, every wedding of a daughter, every private nurse for the elderly relatives at the end, every donation to the Salvation Army sits on top of that arithmetic. Public money, private surface. Now to the interior of the marriage and the household that surface was built around. The published biographies and family accounts are consistent on one point. The household in Jamaica Estates was organized from top to bottom around Fred. His work, his schedule, his tastes, his silences, his terms. The biographer Gwenda Blair, in her book The Trumps, describes a marriage in which Fred was the relentless, frugal, work-centered builder, and Mary Anne was the home, the children, and the family's social and charitable face. The granddaughter, Mary L. Trump, in her memoir Too Much and Never Enough, published in 2020, describes a household in which, in her account, attributed to her here by name, her grandfather was the dominant force and her grandmother, in practice, had limited authority inside the walls of her own home. That is Mary L. Trump's characterization, published in her own book, and this film puts it in her mouth and not our own. Nobody on the record has described the marriage as cruel. Nobody on the record has described it as a private hell. This film is not going to invent that. What the record supports is different, and it is quieter, and it is heavier. A long, traditional, largely silent marriage. A very large class gap between the girl at the pier and the woman at the ballroom. A husband whose terms defined the interior. A wife who held the surface. By 1948, she had 5 children, ranging in age from newborn to 11. She was 36 years old. She was about to almost die. Chapter 7. 1948. The year the body almost gave. After the birth of her 5th child, Robert, in 1948, she suffered a medical crisis that nearly killed her, and the childbearing years ended in one long fluorescent-lit corridor. Robert Trump was born in 1948. It was her 5th pregnancy in 11 years. She was 36. By the standards of the time, she was, obstetrically, an experienced mother. She had, on paper, no particular reason to expect the 5th delivery to be materially more dangerous than the 4th. What happened in the weeks immediately after Robert's birth is described in the published biographical record with a certain careful uniformity. Gwenda Blair, in her book The Trumps, mentions it. Later reporting refers to it. The granddaughter Mary L. Trump, in her 2020 memoir, gives the fullest telling of it as an event that shaped the family. In her account, attributed to her here as it must be, her grandmother suffered a severe postpartum haemorrhage. The bleeding was serious enough that Mary Anne was rushed into surgery. An emergency hysterectomy was performed to save her life. That surgery was followed in the following weeks by further abdominal complications, further surgeries, an extended hospital stay, and a long, slow, incomplete recovery. In Mary L. Trump's account, her grandmother came close to dying more than once during that recovery period. Hold the specific medicine of it for a moment. A postpartum haemorrhage in 1948 in a major American hospital was already treatable. The invention of blood banking, the improvements in surgical technique, the widening use of antibiotics had, by the end of the Second World War, transformed the survival odds of a woman in serious obstetric trouble. Even so, maternal mortality in the United States in the late 1940s was, by modern standards, high. Women in her situation in that decade sometimes did not survive. She survived. But she survived by the width of an operating table, and she survived at the cost of the ability to have any more children. The emergency hysterectomy ended her reproductive life at 36. The abdominal complications that followed left lasting effects on her health, most visibly, in the decades to come, on her bones. Osteoporosis, or something that presented like it, would trouble her later years. The bone issues, according to the family's accounts, are traced by them back to this episode in 1948. Now hold what was happening inside the house on the Jamaica Estates house during the months of her recovery. 5 children. The oldest, Mary Anne, was 11. The next, Fred Jr., was almost 10. Elizabeth was 6. Donald was 2. Robert was a newborn. Their mother, in a hospital, in and out of surgery for weeks. Their father, on his job sites in Queens and Brooklyn, running the business. In Mary L. Trump's account, and again, this is her characterization, attributed to her by name, the children were largely left to a combination of household staff and their father during the months of her mother-in-law's recovery. Her account describes a household in which the emotional temperature was, in her reading, permanently altered by that stretch of absence and that stretch of physical crisis. Fred, in her telling, did not adapt. He continued to run the household as he had run it. The children, especially the younger ones in her reading, absorbed what their mother's near death and long recovery did to the warmth of the house. That is Mary L. Trump's account, and this film sits it exactly there, in her book, on the shelf, attributed. We do not narrate the internal family detail as settled fact. We do not describe the specific temperature of specific dinners. We do not know. What the granddaughter has written is the fullest published account, and, because so many members of the family are living, it is the account we attribute to her, and stop. What is not attributed and can be stated plainly is this. Mary Anne almost died in 1948. The childbearing was over. The body was permanently marked. The recovery was long. She was 36. She had crossed the ocean at 18. She had married up at 23. She had borne 5 children in 11 years. And now, at the middle of her life, the body that had done all of this had, in one long stretch on a hospital ward, given her back a warning she would carry for the next 50 years. She recovered, in the sense of returning home, in the sense of resuming her role as the wife of Fred Trump in Jamaica Estates. She did not recover, in the sense of ever again being the woman she had been before the 5th pregnancy. That woman was gone. The woman who came home from the hospital was a woman who had been given, at 36, a lesson in the physical price of the position she held. She said very little about it. Fred kept building. The Federal Housing Administration kept insuring the mortgages. The apartment complexes kept going up in Queens and Brooklyn. The 5th child kept crying in his crib. And Act 2 of this life, the long, slow assembly of the surface, ended in an operating theatre. Act 3 is the years in which the surface, complete, is displayed. And it is the years in which the surface, complete, begins to be tested by the world outside the ballroom. 6 years after her 5th delivery, in the summer of 1954, her husband was called to Washington. Chapter 8. The Senate calls Fred to Washington. In 1954, the United States Senate sat Fred Trump down in a hearing room and asked how much of the fortune around Mary Anne had been made on the taxpayer's dollar. The hearings were held by a United States Senate subcommittee, and the object of the inquiry was one specific accusation. Federal Housing Administration financing over the previous 20 years had, the senators alleged, been extraordinarily lucrative for a small number of American builders. Specifically, some builders had, in the eyes of the subcommittee, walked away with what became known as windfall profits. They had borrowed against FHA-insured mortgages, built the buildings for less than the mortgage covered, kept the difference, and, in some cases, kept renting the buildings on top of that. The Senate wanted to know how much money had gone in this way to whom, and it began, in 1954, calling the men who had built with FHA financing to explain themselves. Fred Trump was one of the men called. He appeared before the subcommittee. He answered questions. The exact structure of who owned what and which family entity had ended up with which piece of the surplus was picked over in the hearing room. He kept the money already made. But the FHA, in the aftermath of the inquiry, effectively blacklisted him from further federal housing program work. He never built another major project on FHA financing. The relationship at that point was over. Fred moved on. He built with other financing structures, in other neighborhoods, at other scales, for the rest of his career. Frame that for a moment against the woman in Jamaica Estates in the summer of 1954. She was 42. She had 5 children, ranging from 5 to 17. She was 6 years out from the operating theatre. She was, on the surface, at exactly the moment when a woman in her position ought to be, in the ordinary language of the local society pages, coming into her own. The hospital committee work, the philanthropic self-placement, the set hair, the tailored suits, the gradual acceptance by the older queens and Long Island wives who had watched her join their tables of her presence at them. And in Washington that summer, her husband was being questioned about how much of the money that paid for those tables had, in effect, come out of the federal budget. The public conversation about the Trump family, in later decades, has almost never named this correctly. It has focused, understandably, on the son. It has focused on the buildings that carry the family name. It has focused on the politics. What it has rarely done is trace the arithmetic of the fortune back to a Senate hearing room in 1954 in which the federal government sat the family's builder down and asked, on the record, how much of it had been paid for by federally underwritten mortgages. The answer was, in relative terms, a great deal. And the arithmetic of that answer runs directly under Jamaica Estates, and under the ballroom, and under the fur stole, and under the pavilion door. This is the hidden reality this chapter is here to name. Not a scandal about her personally. She was not in the hearing room. She was not in the meetings with the FHA. She was not on the mortgages. This is a hidden reality about the class distance she had crossed, and about the specific American system that made that distance crossable at the scale it was crossed. She had not crossed on her own labor alone. She had crossed on the back of federally insured lending, applied to Brooklyn and Queens apartment blocks, by a husband who had spent the 1930s and 40s working the system exactly the way the system had, at that point, permitted itself to be worked. Public money underwrote the mortgages underwrote the buildings underwrote the rents underwrote the fortune underwrote the house in Jamaica Estates, the house underwrote the staff underwrote the free time underwrote the philanthropic committee schedule, the committee schedule underwrote the pavilion, and on the wall of the pavilion, in gold letters, in the fullness of time, they set her name. That is one way to trace an American life across the middle of the 20th century. Follow the money. Follow it back through the ballroom, back through the fur stole, back through the hospital committee table, back through the house on the Jamaica Estates house, back through the rents, back through the buildings, back through the mortgages, back through the Federal Housing Administration, back through the Senate hearing room of 1954. The trail runs, at the end, to the arm of the American federal government. Now go the other way. Follow it forward again from 1954. Follow it forward into the 1950s and the 1960s and the 1970s, into the 25, 30, 40 years of her public philanthropic peak. Follow it forward into the woman we now have to spend the next chapter with. Because after 1954, after the Senate had done what the Senate was going to do, the fortune was already made. The blacklist did not undo it. The rents kept coming. And the wife of the builder in Jamaica Estates, in her 40s and 50s and 60s, was going, for the next 30 years, to spend that money on the specific project she had been working on since the middle of the 1930s. Being seen. Chapter 9. Mrs. Fred Trump of Jamaica Estates at the ballroom door. By the middle of the 1950s, she had become, publicly and completely, Mrs. Fred Trump of Jamaica Estates, and the surface she had built could be seen from a passing car. This chapter belongs to her, without qualification. This is the peak of the project she had been on since the day she arrived. Every other person in this film, at this point, moves to the wings. Fred is in the office. The children are in school, in college, in their first jobs. The building empire is running. The rents are coming. And the woman on the Jamaica Estates house, in the second half of the 1950s and through the 1960s and into the early 1970s, is executing, at full scale, the transformation into a public philanthropic matriarch. Watch that persona in operation, week by week, across a decade. The Women's Auxiliary of Jamaica Hospital was part of the rhythm of her life. The auxiliary raised money for the hospital. She was involved with it for years. Her long involvement is documented in the local record. Alongside the auxiliary, she gave her time and her name to a series of local and regional charities. Cerebral palsy services, in the era when cerebral palsy was one of the disabilities the American public was learning to name and to fund, took her on to committees. Disability services more broadly used her on their letterheads. The Salvation Army had her on its lists. The Boy Scouts of America had her on its donor rolls. Services for the blind had her at their tables. It was a broad, respectable outer borough and near suburban Long Island philanthropic circuit, and she was, for something like 3 decades, one of its steady faces. She built the persona deliberately. That has to be said clearly, because the alternative reading, the reading that treats her as passive, is wrong. Nobody handed her the role of Mrs. Fred Trump of Jamaica Estates. She built it. She got herself onto the committees. She kept herself on the committees. She showed up. She wrote the notes. She wore the right suit. She kept the hair. She kept the composure. And year after year, the local papers, the hospital newsletters, the charity brochures printed her name and her photograph in the same places, and the persona hardened into a recognizable local fact. The furs and the set hair and the committee table are not, in this reading, a costume. They are the working uniform of an immigrant girl who has decided, deliberately, at the level of daily discipline, that she is going to be publicly, unmistakably, and permanently unlike the girl who stepped off the Transylvania on the 11th of May, 1930. She was not, at these tables, especially warm. She was not especially cold. She was composed. That is the word every account of her uses. Composed. She did not tell stories at the microphone. She did not perform in the way some hospital committee wives performed. She was there, she was correct, and she was next. The large house in Jamaica Estates supported the persona. It had staff. It had many rooms. It was, materially, a machine for holding the surface in place, and she ran the machine. The children moved through and out of it. Mary Anne moved on toward the federal bench she would eventually sit on. Fred Jr., in ways this film returns to shortly, did not thrive. Elizabeth grew up quietly. Donald went into his father's business. Robert followed, in his own way, in the family's business orbit. The house on the Jamaica Estates house shed children and gained silence around the wife who ran it. She kept her ties to Lewis. That has to be said, because the reduction of her life to the American surface is not quite right. She went home. She travelled, more than once, back to the Isle of Lewis, back to Tong. She visited the family that remained. She walked, in her 60s and 70s, on the ground she had walked on as a child. And she did all of this in Gaelic. She had never stopped speaking it. When she stood in her sister's kitchen in Tong, she was, again, in the language of her childhood. In the language of the arrival hall in New York, in the language of the ballroom in Long Island. She was, and remained, a poised English speaker with a faint Highland accent. In her mother tongue, she was the last of 10 children of Malcolm and Mary MacLeod, and she never was not. Here is the recurring motif. Here is the second sounding of it. In 1930, an immigration clerk had written down in his own hand, next to her name, one word: domestic. 30 years later, 25 years after that word, she sat at a hotel ballroom in Long Island with a fur stole across the back of her chair and greeted a room. 35 years later, she sat at another one and greeted another one. 35 years and one word. You could put the two pieces of paper side by side. The manifest of 1930. The programme for a 1965 hospital gala at which Mrs. Fred Trump of Jamaica Estates was listed on the fundraising committee. They belong to the same person. They belong to the same country. They belong to the same century. And the entire American promise, the entire American reinvention, sits in the distance between them. She was at the top of the surface she had built. She held it for as long as the world let her. Then, in 1981, her eldest son died at 42. Chapter 10. 1981. The son she buried at 42. Her eldest son, Fred Jr., died at 42 in 1981, and she never publicly spoke of it at length. Fred Trump Jr. had been born in 1938, the second of Mary Anne and Fred's 5 children. From the beginning, by the accounts of the biographers, he was the family's more sensitive son. He was, per the tellings, not built the way his father was built, and he was not built the way his younger brother, who came into the world 8 years after him, was built. He was, in a family of hard, cost-counting, work-driven men, softer. He trained as a commercial airline pilot. That was his own choice, and, per the biographies, it was made against the pull of the family business. He wore the uniform. He flew the routes. He was, more importantly for the story of his mother, a man who had chosen the life himself, outside the family building operation. The choice did not hold. The pull of the family, per Gwenda Blair's account, and per the account of his daughter Mary L. Trump in her memoir, was strong. Fred, the father, wanted his eldest son in the family business. There was pressure. Fred Jr. returned to the family building operation. He did not, per the accounts, thrive in it. He was not, per the accounts, temperamentally suited to it. The father was disappointed. The son knew he was disappointed. The younger brother was rising. Alcoholism followed. That is the plain fact, and it is documented in the family's own later accounts and in the biographical record. Fred Jr. struggled with a drinking problem that grew steadily worse. His health deteriorated. In the last stretch, per the family's accounts, the decline was steep. He died, at the age of 42 in 1981, of medical complications the family has, over the years, described as directly related to alcoholism. His mother was 69. Think about what a mother, at 69 in 1981, buries when she buries her firstborn son at 42. She buries the older child of her 20s, the firstborn of 5 children she carried across 11 years. She buries the son who trained as a pilot and got out. She buries the son who came back. She buries the boy who, in every family, in every era, was the first sound of another generation. She said very little about it. That is the documented fact, and it is the one that belongs in this film. She said very little in public, on the record, about the death of Fred Jr. She grieved, we can safely say, in whatever way she grieved. She did not narrate it. She did not stop the charity work. She did not stop the hospital committees. She did not stop the fur stole and the composed half-smile at the ballroom table. What she carried behind the surface, and the surface did not move. Mary L. Trump, Fred Jr.'s daughter, was young when her father died. Her memoir, Too Much and Never Enough, is the fullest published account of the family's inner life in the years around his death and the decades that followed. This film uses her, as it has used her throughout, as a source, and not as a character. She is a living public figure. Her account is her account. She has, in her memoir, offered a critical reading of the family's response to her father's death. That is her characterization, attributed to her by name. This film sits it there, in her book, and moves on. What sits in the record, without attribution, is that Mary Anne outlived her firstborn son by 19 years. 19 years in which she went again to the ballroom. 19 years in which she went again to the pavilion. 19 years in which she wore the fur stole and the composed half-smile, and did not narrate, in public, on the record, what it had been like, in the summer and autumn of 1981, to hold the position she held in Jamaica estates and bury a child. The silence is the point. It has to be. This is a woman who spent her whole American life inside a project of composure, and one of the things that composure was designed to hold in place was, in the fullness of time, a private grief the world was not going to be invited into. She had built the frame in the 1930s. She held it in the 1948 illness. She held it in the 1954 Senate hearing. She held it in the ballrooms of the 1960s. She held it in 1981 at the funeral of her eldest son. The frame did not crack, but the outside world was going to lean on it, hard, one more time. 10 years later, on a Queen's Street she had walked past 1,000 times, an old woman in her 70s would be pulled to the ground by a boy she had never seen for the $14 she was carrying in her handbag. Chapter 11. 1991, $14, and an old woman on a Queen's Street. On the 31st of October, 1991, near a shopping area in Queens, a 16-year-old boy knocked 79-year-old Mary Anne MacLeod Trump to the ground and took her handbag. The date is the 31st of October, Halloween. She was 79. She had that day driven, or been driven, to a shopping area in Queens. She was, per the reporting, out on the ordinary business of the ordinary day. She parked. She walked. She was, at that point, an old woman in the outer borough she had lived in for more than half a century. A teenager, 16 years old, approached her. He knocked her to the ground. He took her handbag. He ran. The bag contained about $14. Sit inside that number for a moment, because it is the film's cleanest scale contrast, and it belongs to be sat inside. $14 in a handbag. On the arm of a woman whose family fortune at that moment was reported in the hundreds of millions of dollars. On the arm of a woman whose husband owned or had owned, over the course of his career, thousands upon thousands of apartment units across the outer boroughs. on the arm of a woman who lived at that moment in a house on the Jamaica Estates house that had been the family seat for close to 50 years. $14 in her handbag on a Queen's sidewalk, and a boy pulled her down to take them. Her injuries were severe: broken ribs, facial injuries, other fractures, bleeding on the brain, lasting damage to her sight and to her hearing. She was 79, and the impact of a hard fall onto the sidewalk was, for a woman with the bone problems that had followed her since the 1948 illness, catastrophic. She was taken to a hospital. She was treated for the head injury, for the fractures, for the internal bleeding. She survived. She would carry, for the rest of her life, the permanent damage to her hearing and to her vision that came from that afternoon. There is one more character in this scene, and he deserves his name in the film. A bread truck driver named Lawrence Herbert was passing at the moment of the attack. He saw. He stopped. He gave chase. He caught the teenager. He recovered the handbag. He returned it. He then called for help. He was a working man doing his route. He was the person on the street who stopped when a stranger fell, chased the boy who had hurt her, and returned her possessions. The teenager was caught. He pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to a term in prison. That is the criminal record, and it belongs on the page for completeness. Now step back and look at the scene as it belongs to this film. A fur-coated, fine-boned, 79-year-old woman is on the sidewalk in Queens with a broken face and blood in her brain. And next to her, in the gutter, is the empty handbag that had been holding $14. And the boy who took the $14 is running down the street. The entire life she had built at that instant is on the concrete. The pier at 1930, the visa, the $50, the Transylvania, the wedding at the Carlyle, the 5 children, the near death at 36, the house on the Jamaica Estates house, the Federal Housing Administration, the Senate hearing, the hospital committees, the auxiliary, the pavilion, all of it. She had crossed the ocean at 18. She had married up at 23. She had built the surface for 6 decades. And at 79, near a shopping area in Queens, a boy she had never met dropped her onto the sidewalk for the cost of 2 subway rides. The American promise is that the surface, once built, will hold. That is the whole implicit deal. You reinvent yourself. You put in the work. You hold the composure. And in return, the country agrees to see you the way you have taught it to see you. The 1991 mugging is the world reminding her, briefly and violently, that the deal is provisional. Composure does not stop a boy on a sidewalk. Fur does not stop a fist. The pavilion door does not stop the fall. She was, for the length of that afternoon, an old woman in Queens who had nothing that could not be taken from her by a stranger for $14. She recovered enough to go home. She never fully recovered. The hearing damage stayed. The vision damage stayed. She wore glasses. She wore hearing aids. She was, in the last decade of her life, more fragile than she had been on either side of it. She did not, so far as the record shows, talk publicly about it at length. Of course she did not. She was Mary Anne MacLeod Trump. She had, by 1991, been Mrs. Fred Trump of Jamaica Estates for close to 55 years. The composure was the point. The composure was the whole life. And even at the end of a Queen's afternoon, on which she had been pulled to the sidewalk for the cost of a sandwich, the composure did not break. She went home. She healed as far as she was going to heal. She put the coat back on. She put the hair back up. She went, in due course, back to the ballroom. She was 79 years old. She had 8 years left. Chapter 12. 1999. The frame closes. Fred Trump died on the 25th of June, 1999, at 93. and the marriage of 63 years that had held the whole reinvention closed with him. He had been ill for some time. The relentless, cost-counting, work-driven man had been, for a period of years, no longer that man. His obituaries recorded the outlines of his career, the apartment complexes, the reach across Queens and Brooklyn. The estate reported in the hundreds of millions of dollars, the 5 children, and, in the small final paragraph, his surviving wife of 63 years. 63 years. Say it once and hold it. 63 years is a very long time. It is longer than the average American life expectancy at the moment when they married. It is longer than the American century has held any particular form. It is longer than the FHA had existed at the moment of his death. It is longer than the Federal Housing Administration would exist under some of the names it had subsequently taken. It is longer than any of her 5 children had been alive. It is longer than any of her grandchildren had been alive. It is the entire adult life of the woman who had walked into the Carlyle Hotel in January of 1936, at 23, on the arm of a young builder from the Bronx. The frame was gone. That is the fact that has to be sat with. Everything the surface had been built to hold, the interior of Jamaica estates, the position, the standing, the philanthropic seat, the fur stole on the back of the ballroom chair, had been held in place by one relationship, and that relationship had, on the 25th of June, 1999, ended. She was 87. She had been Mrs. Fred Trump of Jamaica Estates for 63 years. Her identity, her class position, her public role, her house, her staff, her placement in the local society pages, her seat on the hospital committee, the plaque on the wall of the pavilion, her whole American surface had been built on the marriage. Fred was gone. The frame did not, immediately, fall. She was still Mrs. Fred Trump of Jamaica Estates on the letterhead, in the paperwork of the auxiliary, in the mind of the neighborhood. But the man who had made her Mrs. Fred Trump of Jamaica Estates, the one relationship inside the 63-year figure, was not now on the other side of the dining table. Some part of her, at that stage, had already been quietly withdrawing. The years since the mugging in 1991 had been a slow physical retreat. The hearing was worse. The vision was worse. The bones were worse. She was, in the last decade, more inside the house than she had ever been. The pavilion was on its wall. The auxiliary was on its committees. She was, at last, mostly at home. The estate at his death was, per contemporary reporting and later investigation, in the hundreds of millions of dollars. New York Times reporting years later, in 2018, would trace the movement of much of it to the children over the course of decades through a series of family structures, trusts, and business entities. Mary Anne was, in the will and in the various family arrangements, provided for on the terms a 63-year wife of a wealthy builder is provided for. She was not the executor. She was not, per the public record of the will, the primary steward of the fortune's onward movement. That work had been organized, years before Fred's death, around the children, and in particular around the son who had by then become, in his own right, a very well-known New York developer. There is a small, telling detail from the year of Fred's funeral, and it belongs on the page for what it says about the surface she had spent 60 years holding. The service, at a prominent Manhattan church long associated with the family, was, by every account of it, a very large affair. The building was full. The old associates of the family were there. The developers of the outer boroughs were there. The Manhattan society Fred and Mary Anne had, over the decades, moved among on the edges of, was there. And Mary Anne, at 87, in the front pew, with the composed half-smile that stopped before it reached her eyes, greeted the room she had built. She did not speak from the pulpit. She did not need to. The pew held her place, as the ballroom had held her place, and the pavilion had held her place for 63 years. And then Fred was gone. And even the home was different. And there was, for the 63-year Mrs. Fred Trump of Jamaica Estates, only one architecture left to arrive at, the one that comes for everybody. She had a little over a year. Chapter 13. The 7th of August, the year 2000. She died on the 7th of August, in the year 2000, at 88, at a hospital on Long Island, a little over a year after Fred. She had been fragile in her late years. She had been widowed for a little over a year. She had held the position of Mrs. Fred Trump of Jamaica Estates for 63 years. The record does not narrate the details of her last day. She died. She was gone. Her funeral was held at a prominent Manhattan church, long associated with the family. The service brought the surviving family, her 4 surviving children, her grandchildren, the professional and social circle that had gathered, over the decades, around the Trump name. The public prominence of the family, by the year 2000, meant the funeral drew the kind of press coverage that funerals in outer borough Queens, of the wives of outer borough builders, do not ordinarily draw. Even so, at the level of the ceremony itself, it was a family funeral, and it was ordered around the surface she had spent her life building. She was buried at a cemetery in Queens, in the borough, where her adult life had been lived, 88 years, and the small closing arithmetic of a very long American life. The obituaries that ran in the summer of the year 2000 tracked, in outline, the story this film has been through. Born on the Isle of Lewis, youngest of 10, came to America at 18, married the New York builder Fred Trump in 1936, 5 children, long involvement with Jamaica Hospital, survived by 4 of the 5 children, by many grandchildren, by great-grandchildren, died peacefully after a period of ill health. The standard vocabulary of the American local paper applied to a life that had, at every point of it, been more specific and more precise than the vocabulary could carry. Then there is one detail this film has to sit with, because it is one of the reasons this story matters at this specific moment in American life. She died in the year 2000. She did not live to see her son become President of the United States in the years after 2016. Across those years, his mother was invoked. She was invoked in speeches. She was invoked in interviews. She was invoked, in her own family's public accounts, as the immigrant success story at the root of his own life. She was invoked, in the campaigns against him, as the reason his rhetoric on immigration was, at minimum, hypocritical, and, in some circles, as a target of contested and false claims about how she had entered the country. None of it, in her presence, ever occurred. She was gone before it began. The woman defined, across a 60-year public life, by her near-total refusal to speak in public about herself, did not have to answer, in life, for the loudest chapter her family's name has ever generated. She did not have to sit in a chair opposite a network television anchor in the summer of a presidential campaign and be asked what she thought her son had inherited from her and what she thought he had not. She did not have to hold, at 88 or 98, the composure she had held for 60 years, on a stage on which her own image was being torn open and reinterpreted from every direction. She died, and the silence, at that point, closed over. Her reputation has been reassessed in her absence in the years since 2016. 2 readings run through the public conversation about her, and this film sits between them without settling them. On one side, she has been treated as the classic American immigrant success story, brought forward, in her family's own public tellings, as the woman who came with $50 and made a life. On the other side, her granddaughter Mary Trump, in her memoir, has offered an account of the household in which her grandmother appears as, in her granddaughter's characterization, a partly absent presence during her long 1948 recovery, and, in the years after, a figure of the family's emotional restraint. Both are readings. Both come from living participants in a political argument this film is not equipped and not willing to arbitrate. What this film goes by is the record, the croft, the crossing, the visa, the word domestic, the marriage, the 5 children, the 1948 illness, the 1954 Senate inquiry, the philanthropic peak, the son buried at 42, the 1991 mugging, the death in the year 2000. Those we can say. Those are the 63 years, on the record, on the paperwork, in the ledgers of the American federal government and the local Queen's press. The rest is argument. We leave it, in this film, in the mouths of the people who have made the arguments, and we return, in the last chapter, to the one image with which we began, the photograph, the fur stole, the pavilion door, the word domestic on the arrival paperwork of the 11th of May, 1930. Chapter 14. The clerk's word, and what we chose not to see. Return with me now to the paperwork of a New York arrival hall on the 11th of May, 1930, and to the one word a clerk wrote down, domestic. That is the third and final sounding of it. Say it once more, and then let it stand for what she was, and for what she became, and for what the American century, watching her, chose not to see. She was an 18-year-old Gaelic-speaking girl from a crofting family in Tong. She had, per the paperwork of her arrival, about $50. She spent 5 years, on and off, scrubbing other people's kitchens. She married a builder in 1936 and did not, publicly, look back. She built a public surface across the next 60 years that was, in the assessment of every neighbour and every hospital committee she sat on, correct, composed, respectable, and complete. She got herself put on the wall of a hospital pavilion. She got herself into the local society pages. She got herself, in due course, into the mother slot of one of the loudest political careers in American history. And she did all of it while saying, on the record, in her own voice, almost nothing. We watched Mrs. Fred Trump of Jamaica Estates. We watched her at the ballroom table. We watched her at the pavilion door. We watched her in the newspapers of the outer boroughs. We saw the set hair and the fur stole and the composed half-smile that stopped before it reached her eyes. And we did not, in the 63 years she was Mrs. Fred Trump of Jamaica Estates, ask her one loud question about how a woman gets from the arrival paperwork of the 11th of May, 1930, to the pavilion door on the wall of a Queen's hospital. We admired the pavilion. We were meant to. She had built it to be admired. We admired the fur stole. We were meant to. She had bought it to be admired. We admired the composed half-smile. We were meant to. She had rehearsed it for 40 years. And in the room behind all of that, the room the fur stole was designed to keep us from looking into, there was a hospital ward in 1948 in which a 36-year-old woman almost bled to death. There was a funeral in 1981 for a 42-year-old son. There was a Queen's sidewalk in 1991 on which a 79-year-old woman lay with a broken face and blood in her brain, for the sake of the $14 in her handbag. There was a marriage of 63 years, described by the biographers and by the granddaughter, as organized on the terms of the man across the table, in which the woman across the table held her surface and said, in public, almost nothing. There was, at the root of all of it, the $50 of an 18-year-old girl and the word domestic in a clerk's hand. Every one of those rooms was there the whole time. Every one of those rooms was in the photograph we admired. We did not ask about them. because the photograph was designed not to be asked about. And she did not offer to tell us, because the whole point of the surface was that it did not admit that anything was underneath it. For 60 years, in her own words, on the record, she said almost nothing. For 60 years in front of her, we watched the fur stole. The gap between the two documents, the arrival paperwork of 1930 and the plaque on the pavilion wall of the 1980s, is the whole distance an American immigrant life can travel in the 20th century. That is not a small thing. It is the reason the American surface is, in the first place, worth building. She crossed the distance almost as far as it can be crossed. She died a wealthy widow with a hospital pavilion in her name in the year 2000 at 88, with a Manhattan funeral and a Queen's burial, with a son on the way to the White House and a daughter on the way to the federal bench. But the price of the surface is exactly the silence the surface requires. That is the harder truth, and this channel exists to say it. Every woman who came after her, every immigrant daughter who crossed an ocean alone into somebody else's kitchen, every woman who married up out of service and then set her hair for 40 years in the local society pages was watching. The surface asked from her a specific and long price. The illness she did not narrate. The son she did not eulogize in public. The husband whose terms she did not describe. The mugging she did not talk about. The 60 years in which the mother tongue lived only in her own head. The whole life unsaid. We took the pavilion. We took the fur stole. We took the composed half smile. We took the immigrant success story, and we ran with it, in one direction or another, in whichever direction our politics wanted her to point. And in doing so, we did not look, seriously, at the specific documented grim that ran under the composure, and at what the composure had cost. The word grimmer, in the title of this film, is a promise about that gap. It is the promise that the private life of Mrs. Fred Trump of Jamaica Estates, in the specific things the record does support, was harder and lonelier and more physically dangerous and more silent than the country outside the ballroom ever knew. It is not a claim about invented cruelty, and the record does not support that claim. It is a claim about the documented shape of an American life spent inside a surface, and about the specific things that surface was built to hold in place. A near death at 36, a buried son at 42, a sidewalk assault at 79, a 63-year marriage that closed only when the man across the table died, and underneath all of it, in a clerk's hand, on a piece of paper filed in a government archive, one word: domestic. Look at the photograph again. The ballroom, the fur stole, the pavilion door, the composed half smile. Look at what she was, and look at what she became, and look at what she did not, ever, tell us about the 63 years in between. That is what we chose not to see. That is what she chose not to say. And in the last analysis, the deal held. She kept the surface. We kept the pavilion. And the woman who arrived on the 11th of May, 1930, with about $50 and one word next to her name, walked, at the end of the American century, into the same room she had built, in the same fur stole, with the same composed half smile, and closed the door behind her. If you have watched this far, subscribe to Disposable Glamour. We spend our time behind exactly these doors, in exactly these ballrooms, with exactly these silences. And tell us in the comments, for 60 years, she said almost nothing. Was that composure, or was it the price of the surface she had built? What do we owe a woman who chose silence to keep the frame in place?